Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kevin Carnes, President of the U.S. Business and Industry Council, which was sponsoring the conference and was founded in 1933 to represent the interest of domestic manufacturers and other domestic businesses. Domestic manufacturers have a perspective that's different from multinational corporations. The same is true of local and regional banks, which are quite different from Wall Street investment banks. The former are still rooted in their communities, and what they do, their successes and failures, impact those communities directly and dramatically. We're here today to discuss the state visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping and his discussions with American business leaders and President Obama. Already the reports from his meetings on the West Coast yesterday indicate that Xi is turning a deaf ear to many of the concerns of the technology business leaders who are anxious to do business in China but faced a host of barriers. Judging by Xi's remarks, those government-imposed barriers are not coming down anytime soon. They include administrative barriers that discriminate against foreign firms operating in China, forced technology transfer, and forced cooperation with the central government in providing so-called backdoor access to American hardware and software in China. Xi claimed he is willing to cooperate on the issue of hacking and cyber theft, but dismissed the other American concerns. Now, one of the agreements that's supposed to come out of the state visit and the meetings with President Obama is an agreement on cyber hacking, cyber theft. But China, of course, has not, as we'll discuss later in the panels, it's not honored its agreements to the WTO since its accession to the WTO. It hasn't honored its commitment to the IMF to avoid Article 4, to avoid manipulating its currency, et cetera. So why, in the case of something like cyber hacking, would the Chinese government honor its commitments? The track record is awful. And in the case of hacking, it's very difficult, as you've seen in the headlines, to trace the source of the hacking. So you can take that with a grain of salt, even if there's or maybe a salt shaker, if there is an agreement. It was quite interesting last week that a member of the Politburo came to the United States and met with high U.S. government officials, and the message he carried was if President Obama announced sanctions before the Xi visit, it would be canceled. Now, there were no sanctions. And so it goes, this game of cat and mouse over business models, market conditions, market share, technology development, military matters, labor, human, and religious rights, and a host of other issues. And guess who, generally speaking, plays the role of the mouse? Hint, it's not China. China is a complex place, but the central feature is that it's a one-party state, run by a party that will do and does anything and everything necessary to maintain its power and preeminence in dominating the country politically, economically, technologically, socially, and every other way one can think of. No aspect of Chinese life is too small to be overlooked by the party as a possible source of dissension or discord that might disrupt its chokehold on Chinese life. Witness the quick persecution, arrest and persecution in connection with reporting on the Chinese stock market crash. Just for doing straight reporting on events, reporters were arrested. The Chinese leadership is extraordinarily proud of its state capitalism model, which they feel is superior to the Western model. And given China's growth rate over the last 15 years or 20 years, one might think that they were correct. But now they've run into a brick wall, and whether or not they have the tools to continue even modest growth is really in doubt. And that growth was based on Chinese mercantilism, currency manipulation, massive government intervention in markets, forced technology transfer, outright technology theft, exploitation of labor generally, slave and prison labor in some cases, and many other practices that we in the West find unwise, illegal, or abhorrent. It appeared that the Chinese government had unleashed market forces after years of failed socialist experiments. However, there was still central government control of almost every aspect of these developing markets. China is currently dealing with the failure of this system, its interventions in the marketplace. The big question is, can it do that successfully without massively impacting the world economy? Or will it continue exporting its overcapacity and potential unemployment instead of shutting down its inefficient producers? Already, it has caused a massive glut of steel in the world marketplace, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But this is a problem that a lot of commentators have not recognized. They say, well, you know, China's stock market, yes, it's in this correction or maybe even a crash, but it's okay because we don't export that much to China. But they're not looking at the other side of the coin. Chinese exports to the West, to the United States in particular, and the exporting of all this capacity, as it were, for which there's no market in China. So let's send it all overseas. Let's not unemploy or fire Chinese workers when we can force American workers, steel workers, out of their jobs. And the first panel, which we're going to start in 1 minute, will discuss the aggressive Chinese military buildup and actions that they have taken. What seems to be missing in Washington is any idea that our massive trade deficit with China and the concomitant hollowing out of our industrial base with its wealth-creating aspects is a large part of the problem. It's a case of following the money, to use the old Watergate phrase. China's defense budget is stated to be about $120 billion, a fraction, people think a fraction of the U.S. defense budget. But there are no reliable numbers of any sort anywhere in China. Other estimates are at $150 billion, up to $600 or $700 billion. We don't really know. And often ignored are the profits that the PLA makes through its own enterprises that they run for profit. In any case, with trade deficits now in the mid $300 billion, the U.S. in effect each year sends China 2.5 times its stated defense budget each and every year. We must get a tight grip on our trade deficit and foreign borrowing here in the U.S. We have added about $8 trillion worth of debt during the Obama administration and are quickly headed to a national debt of $20 billion and more. Getting our trade house in order would have an enormous positive impact on our economy and put pressure on the Chinese to rationalize their economy, including the state-owned industries and military spending. However, I don't expect that these type of achievements are going to come out of the Obama-Xi meetings. And so we'll be watching closely to see what the announcements are, but there are massive and major problems that are unlikely to be addressed. Okay, let's begin our program now.
A number of years ago, the state-sponsored news agency Xinhua listed the top, quote, anti-China experts in the world, and I was #1, along with a number of others. And for the record, I state that I'm not anti-China. I'm very much pro-China, especially the pro-Chinese people. My issue is with the Chinese government and party. On the Chinese military strategy, right now the Chinese are working to drive the United States military out of Asia. That's what's behind the South China Sea. That's what's behind the East China Sea air defense zone. And they're doing this in a number of ways. In terms of their military development, and I'm sure Mark will address this, I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of the areas that the Chinese are building up their weapons through asymmetric weaponry. That is, weapons, they're not trying to confront the United States bomber for bomber, ship for ship, although you could argue maybe in the submarine area they seem to be doing a lot. But they're looking for niche capabilities that will allow a stronger power to defeat, a weaker power to defeat a stronger power, and that's what's behind. So they've picked a few areas, and those areas are missiles, cyber, anti-satellite capability, special operations forces, and submarine undersea warfare. And in all of those areas, the Chinese are either close to reaching our capabilities or are equal to our capabilities, certainly in the cyber arena. And so they're doing this with the stated goal to drive the United States out of Asia. There was an incident a number of years ago where the Pacific commander had a meeting with his Chinese counterpart, and the Chinese admiral said, look, why don't we just divide up the Pacific? You know, we'll take our part and you guys move out and take your part and stay there. And then, of course, you know, this is not going to happen because of U.S. interests in Asia. As it relates to the South China Sea, we had some testimony 2 weeks ago, I think, which was very important. It was the Pacific commander and David Scheer talking to the Senate Armed Services Committee about the situation. And in a recent piece I did for Asia Times, I kind of juxtaposed the two competing views. And I noted that the volume level of U.S.-China military posturing is increasing. 2 weeks ago, PLA Navy Vice Admiral Yuan Yubei said at a conference in London, the South China Sea, as the name indicated, is a sea area. It belongs to China. Several days later, Admiral Harry Harris, the commander of the Pacific Command, had this to say before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The South China Sea is no more China's than the Gulf of Mexico is Mexico's. It was very refreshing to hear a senior military leader so candidly and bluntly state the U.S. position. As you can imagine, David Scheer, a Foreign Service officer, his remarks were much more diplomatic. They were heavily caveated by saying that, well, you know, on the one hand this and on the one hand that. But right now, what's going on in the South China Sea has been underway for a number of years, and it has been largely ignored by the Obama administration. It was only after regional states like the Philippines and Japan began pressuring the administration that suddenly the United States woke up and said, hey, we have a problem here. And the problem is, it began several years ago where China began enforcing something called the 9-dash line, which is a vague, ill-defined area that covers most of the South China Sea. And this sea, of course, is strategically important. The estimates are that $5.3 trillion in trade passes through that water. So it's clearly a huge, huge strategic waterway. And China is clearly trying to control that waterway. And they've done it through kind of a creeping hegemony that's been very carefully laid out, designed to avoid provoking the United States. The 9-dash line was part of this. And the disputed islands in the South China Sea generally fall into two main categories, although there's others. You have the Paracels in the north, and you have the Spratlys in the south. And that's where this island reconstruction has been underway. The Chinese have been dredging undersea around some of these islets and atolls, and then really creating what the latest estimate from 2 weeks ago was that they now have established 2,900 acres of new islands, which they are claiming as Chinese territory. But before they did that, they did a number of kind of semi-administrative things to try and assert control over them. And I outlined them in a couple of the pieces. The first was that they set up in June 2012 an administrative center on what they created it, it's called Sansha City in the South China Sea. This is on Woody Island. It's 186 miles southeast of Hainan Island, and they have a military garrison, and this Sansha City has been given authority over 1.2 million square miles of the South China Sea, including the disputed islands. So they set up this administrative office. Next thing that was observed by the United States was the increase in PLA Navy and especially maritime law enforcement assets, shipping. The Chinese have 6 different paramilitary maritime law enforcement agencies. And for many years, they've been using these agencies rather than the Chinese military, the PLA Navy, in order to maintain a low profile in trying to enforcing their control. The next thing that happened was they announced in April 2013 that they've created a national island surveillance monitoring system that includes airborne remote sensing over 4,406 islands. So that's another preparation of the battle space, if you will. And then on January 1st of 2014, the Maritime Safety Administration announced that it would require all foreign ships in the South China Sea, fishing boats in particular, to first report to Beijing or to the administrative authority in Hainan before they could come into the South China Sea. So this is a real problem. And in the midst of all this, this island building was underway. And now, according to Admiral Harris in his testimony 2 weeks ago, they've now are in the process of building 3 10,000-foot runways, and he pointed out that these are military-length runways that can be used for military purposes. Well, what are the military purposes? He somewhat laid out what the military plans were, but in addition to these runways, where they plan to base Chinese interceptor jets as well as transports, troop transports, they're also building deep water ports which will accommodate the Chinese warships in the area. I'll quote Admiral Harris on this, and he says, and if you look at these facilities, then you can imagine a network of missile sites, runways for their 5th-generation fighters, and surveillance sites, and all of that. It creates a mechanism by which China would have de facto control over the South China Sea in any scenario short of war. And it was interesting what he said. He described these facilities in military terms as grapes. In other words, in a war, they could easily be taken out. But it's in peacetime that these facilities pose a threat because of the de facto control mechanism. The issue, of course, that came out at the hearing, which I didn't mention in this piece, was, of course, why the U.S. has been prohibited from sailing within 12 miles of these new facilities. And the reason is because there's a directive, a political directive, not for the Navy, and Admiral Harris, in a very professional way, expressed his opposition to this when he was pressed by Senator McCain and others to why the U.S. has not asserted what they call freedom of navigation by sailing within 12 miles of these disputed islands. He said, we've presented options. In other words, he very much wants to do that, and he feels that it's very important that we do that we sail there. Contrast this with what happened in early September, where you had 5 PLA warships that traveled to the Bering Strait and sailed within 12 miles of U.S. territory. This was clearly a signal from China that they're going to assert their authority to do that, and the concept was, okay, U.S., you go ahead, do it. I'll stop there and turn it over to our next speaker, and we can, if you have anything to elaborate further, we can do it in the discussion period.
I've been asked to speak a bit on PLA military modernization and looking at some of the implications for U.S. national interests. This is a very, very broad subject, and so how to get your hands around all the different aspects of PLA modernization can be a challenge. From time to time, I'm asked sort of to compare aspects of PLA military modernization, to compare sort of American military strengths, sort of do a sort of this relative strength and weakness assessment, which that also is a very difficult task. But one way to simplify it a bit is to focus on 2 areas that China is organized for, resourced for, and equipped to be able to carry out certain types of operations, areas which they are investing in, areas that we don't actually invest anything in, very minimal, if anything. And there are 2 areas. One is an area in which we don't really consider to be military per se, but it is very, very much integral to the People's Liberation Army operations. And it's an area that we don't have, which is, it goes by many names, but for lack of a better term, one could call it political warfare. This is one of the areas. When I say political warfare, what it really means is an organization, if you can imagine an organization that has the relative organizational bureaucratic stature as the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or the National Security Agency, or Defense Intelligence Agency, that is dedicated toward nothing but manipulating international perceptions about attenuating or amplifying real or latent military capabilities. For lack of a better term, one could call it a deterrence command. Because, of course, bear in mind that deterrence is all about manipulating psychological perceptions. It's about manipulating cost-benefits analysis. And it's a large organization that's equal to, for example, there's a lot of news about Chinese PLA cyber operations, hacking operations in the United States. The primary organization being the General Staff Department, 3rd Department, which is an organizational structure. It's a powerful organization, equal to an Army Corps. They have a whole organization equal to all of their hackers and signals intelligence operators combined that do nothing but, it's called liaison operations, which is be able to sort of manipulate our perceptions, to be able to exploit propaganda channels, to be able to carry out strategic psychological operations, among other things, in order to be able to sort of put themselves in an advantageous position when you look at the broader competition and be able to sort of channel how the United States makes its investments in the Asia-Pacific region and adopts policies. The General Political Department, Liaison Department, has a very, very long history. And this is not, again, this is not a China bashing exercise, but it's just useful to remember the way that the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party is structured for statecraft. They inherited from a general approach the organization structure of the Soviet Communist Party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. For example, they'll have a party structure, state structure, and then military structure. And in the party structure, you'll have, and there's a lot of overlap that happens, but in the party structure, you'll have, for example, the Central Committee and then the Central International Liaison Department or an international department. You'll have a propaganda department, or they call it a publicity department, but propaganda tends to be an easier term to use. And then they will have an organization department and that structure that's there. Within the PLA, they also have they have the Central Military Commission, which is bear in mind that the PLA is a party army. It is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. There is a nominal state function, a government function, but it is a party army. And it's very useful to make this distinction because when one looks at sort of what's really behind some of the drivers behind PLA military modernization, it's useful to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is very, very much at the basis. And so one of the PLA missions, of course, is to enhance the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of ensuring its monopoly on power within China. But within the PLA, you have 4 general departments. You have the General Staff Department, roughly equivalent to our joint staff, for example, our Director of Operations. You have the General Political Department, which is what I'll get into in some detail here, General Logistics Department, and the General Armaments Department. Then you have the Navy, Air Force, and 2nd Artillery, and then military regions. But the GPD is responsible for, it serves in effect, the Director of General Political Department functions as the political commissar in respects to Xi Jinping, who is triple-hatted as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, President, which is head of state, and then, of course, the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. And in his function as Chairman of the Central Military Commission, his political commissar is the Director of the General Political Department. When I say GPD has an operational mission, GPD is responsible for propaganda, organization, a whole range of other issues. For state security, GPD has the role of ensuring security, personnel security within the PLA. But more importantly, they have a role to be able to engage in a broad set of relationships, both within China, within the civilian structure and the military structure, again, to be able to manipulate perceptions both within China and outside of China. Bear in mind that the two are very much linked in ways that really are not readily perceptible. They use a broad range of platforms that aren't necessarily directly subordinate to GPD, but nevertheless are there and available for them to use to be able to manipulate perceptions. And with using certain titles that are very obscure sounding, different associations. Heavy use of non-governmental organizations. Technically, they are non-governmental because they don't come under the government. Again, they're under the party, if there is an argument to be made there, in ways that you wouldn't think that are there. The most famous being China Association for International Friendly Contact. very sort of amorphous sounding name. And it ostensibly civilian, an NGO. It has retired members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there, retired people from the Ministry of State Security. However, its operational core is within the GPD Liaison Department. There are others that operate. When you go to conferences here in Washington, D.C., if you notice a host organization that's sponsoring there is a good chance that actually may be one of these general political department platforms that are there. With the idea on the United States, of course, being the best way is to be able to redirect fundamental planning, U.S. strategy and planning documents to be able to sort of keep them away from what really is the core concerns of the Chinese Communist Party. And I would argue the number one concern about the Chinese Communist Party, the number one core interest, is another independent sovereign state that we don't acknowledge as such, but is the Republic of China. Bear in mind that there are two legitimate governments that have the word China in their constitutionally founded name: People's Republic of China, Republic of China. The reason why Taiwan plays such a central role is that, and it doesn't matter if it's the current party, the KMT, or the opposition party, the DPP, because Taiwan and its system of democracy poses an existential threat to the monopoly that the CCP has over power within the mainland, over on the mainland. And so therefore, GPD Liaison Department, that tends to be their number one focus, is looking at Taiwan. And so what better way to be able to sort of manipulate perceptions and to be able to set the narrative than to be able to get people's attention off of Taiwan and off its democratic development. The objective reality, again, is that there are two legitimate governments on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. There's no question. I've never seen a good case that be made that, and particularly under the Montevideo Conference and others, that says that the ROC actually does exist as a state. We don't treat it as a state, and this is independent of us extending diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. But because of its existence, and because you do have two legitimate governments on both sides, the idea is to be able to set a narrative in which there can be only one representative of China in the international community. So the mantra goes, there's only one China, Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC is the sole representative of China in the international community. That's the mantra, and to give you an idea of how effective they are, they have, over the last 35 years, they've actually been able to condition the international audiences, including here in the United States, to actually be able to buy into this narrative, when actually there are two legitimate governments. And that's a very, very, very important point in terms of the role that GPD plays. With the idea, and here in Washington, the more you can keep Taiwan off the map, they actually have a better chance of being able to conduct united front operations on Taiwan itself, in order to be able to develop sympathies and develop sort of a common basis for a relationship. Anyway, one last point about the General Political Department, Liaison Department. It's often asked the questions of how did Xi Jinping come to power so quickly and be able to enforce his authority over all the organs of the party, state, and military. I would argue one of the key reasons is that, bear in mind that GPD is such a very difficult organization to understand, I would argue that Xi Jinping literally is married to GPD, General Political Department. I say this because, not only in a literal sense, because his wife spent a career as a General Political Department officer, but his father got to start within GPD back during the Revolutionary era. And then Xi Jinping, of course, when he was the Mishu, the executive chief of staff to former Minister of Defense, Geng Biao, notionally most chiefs of staff, the Mishu, actually are GPD officers in that position. And so when you have, for example, in the CMC executive office, most of those offices in the executive office actually come from that background. But the key bosses in a lot of the organization in the PLA actually are political warfare or political officers. Bear in mind the political committees is the secretary of political committees at every level of every organization in the PLA actually is a political commissar. And this is something that's often overlooked. I would argue, in terms of the last comment on the political work system, is one of the it's easy to look at the PLA's strengths and how they would be able to sort of have certain advantages over both the United States and also friends and allies in the region. But it's also looking at the nature of the political work system, because one of their significant vulnerabilities is actually that particular strength. Because when you have a political work system, it's going to have an effect on on some of their operational capabilities. So that's the first capability that they have that we don't have. We don't have this in our Department of Defense. We don't have an organization that does nothing like a Department of Deterrence. In our view, we have a stick. Our deterrence is simply we're just going to show you, what we can beat you with, without really looking at and going into detail about how you can sort of shape behavior on the other side through a whole range of instruments. The second capability that we don't have, and this gets into sort of hard military capabilities, just very quickly, and I can address questions later, are conventional land-based ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges of between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. In fact, if you did an exercise and you take these ballistic missiles, conventional ballistic missiles and land attack cruise missiles off the table and you look at various scenarios, what you may find is a relatively well-balanced and relatively stable situation in which neither the offense nor defense has an advantage. But in my view, it is these long-range precision strike assets, ballistic missiles, that are very difficult to defend against, that really brings the PLA into an advantageous position, particularly in scenarios around the periphery of China. I don't necessarily view ballistic missiles as relevant in the South China Sea. In the scenario there, they may be, only if the U.S. Is involved, because they don't need them to go after potential adversaries there. Ballistic missiles are mostly relevant. Again, it goes back to Taiwan. There are 6 conventional ballistic missile brigades opposite Taiwan that are very relevant in that scenario. The reason why we don't have this capability in terms of land-based ballistic and land attack cruise missiles is because we are constrained and have been constrained, both us and the former Soviet Union, under the INF Treaty signed in 1987, actually dismantled this entire capability that we had before. This is the first treaty in history in which an entire class of weapons were taken off the table. And this because both Moscow and Washington at the time viewed these types of capabilities, ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, as inherently destabilizing. Since this time, Beijing's growth in their ballistic missile capabilities came about in the vacuum created by the INF Treaty. And the PLA has gotten a pass, and there's very little pressure on the PLA to be able to bring in this particular capability and sort of make things sort of a more fair playing field in the region. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you and answer questions later.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The security or military-minded members of the China Commission, when they heard Patrick Malloy call for a national competitiveness strategy, they basically told him he was in the wrong commission or the wrong room, that it was supposed to be reviewing security and military issues. What you usually find in meetings with the president on China policy is the security people come in, they have their session, they have their talking points, they have their issues, then they leave. Then the trade representative's office comes in, or Commerce Department, or other departments of the government. There might even be an Assistant Secretary of State to bring up human rights and democracy issues. But my very first recommendation is sort of a complicated sentence. If we take the need for a national competitiveness strategy seriously, we would want to compete with China. That is, all parts of the U.S. government would want to compete with China in probably a cooperative way. So the first recommendation I make is to recognize the problem of competitiveness with China. This is actually very difficult for our government to do. We have a lot of senior people with PhDs in the Treasury Department who have told me when I raised this issue, oh no, you don't understand. You're too much in the Pentagon and CIA your whole life. You don't understand. Countries don't compete. Companies compete. Corporations compete. So I was made to feel quite belittled, quite stupid. It is true, I did spend my life not in the Treasury Department. And I found out this is a very common mainstream view among a lot of economists and a lot of government departments. We do not compete now with China economically, and we should not. It's only our companies. So turning this thinking around becomes one of my first recommendations. And there are various ways to do it, especially if the Department of Defense and the CIA, the military services, began to get interested in trade and economic and competitiveness issues. So Patrick Malloy, I begin with his story that the military trained people on the China Commission who heard him raise this recommendation, this is at least 10 years ago, Patrick, thought he was in the wrong room at the wrong meeting. He was right, they were wrong. Some progress has been made, but not very much. My second recommendation has to do with metrics. Everybody in companies knows about metrics. You have to measure how you're doing. And what you choose to measure is quite important, because if the executives all know you're measuring this, then they can focus on that metric. We don't have metrics for how we're doing competitively as a nation. And I propose there should be legislation to request from the president every year or every 2 years a national competitiveness report. Some idea of how to do this is provided already by Davos. The World Economic Forum does a national competitiveness report now and ranks the top 20 countries. But how do they do it? They do it for a very small budget. They call people on the phone and say, how do you think different countries are doing? Then they sort of manipulate the data, and that's their national competitiveness index. That's a good thing. It's better than nothing, but it's very different from taking the National Science Foundation indicators of how we're doing with other countries in science, taking Defense Department studies of how we're doing with the military balance, Commerce Department studies, what's called NIST does a lot of comparative work. Things Kevin Kearns used to work on at the Strategic Trade Policy Office could be measured, but we would need to have a national competitiveness index to see how we're doing. And it will take considerable thought to develop what indicators should be in that index and how to weight each one. The third recommendation I make has to do with forming a coalition in Washington. Right now, as everybody here knows, if Wei Jingsheng is here, it must be about human rights and the fifth modernization. If USTR is here, it's not about the fifth modernization and human rights, it's about non-trade barriers. If Bob Fu is here, it's about religious freedom. If somebody from NASA is here explaining why we need to cooperate with China on the space station, but we can't because Senator Barbara Mikulski is blocking it for human rights reasons, then only the NASA people are present. I can go on. There's roughly 20 slices of the China strategy problem. Non-proliferation is another one. When you call a meeting about non-proliferation, only those experts attend. The other 19 slices of the puzzle do not. This is a dream come true for China. My hunch is, based on what Mark Stokes said about the General Political Department, my own experience visiting China, they tend to cooperate under party leadership to have what could be called a holistic strategy toward the Americans. So when the security people are there, the trade people are also there, and they don't leave after their session is finished, like we're going to do, right? Bill, you're not going to stay for the trade talk, are you? Economic Policy Institute, the law firm is going to talk about those issues. You've got more important things to do involving national security. It's very understandable. I don't mean to pick on you. I'm going to stay because of my advocacy of a grand coalition way of thinking about China. I'll put several recommendations together. We don't spend enough as a government. We spend about $50 million now on human rights and democracy in China. It took me a long time to get that number. Patrick, there's a Congressional Research Service report requested by some senators, which was very difficult to put together to find out what is the American federal budget for human rights and democracy in China. People thought it might be $3 million. Some said, oh, surely it's so important to our country to have a democracy in China over the next 10 or 20 years. It must be $1 billion. And by adding up the components for National Endowment for Democracy, for part of Radio Free Asia, for the Freedom House budget, which is mainly from the State Department. All these components look like together they're $50 million. Now that might be okay if China was a small African country with human rights problems like Zimbabwe. A lot of countries have similar amounts of money. China is rank ordered in budget spending the same as medium-sized African countries. Or pick other examples, there's other examples in the world. This is wrong. This is not enough money. It explains why the coalitions among human rights activists and democracy activists are as weak as they are. There's no money there. There's no journal. There's no annual summit. All this can be done with more money. But first, as I say, it was hard enough just to find out what the total budget is. By the way, no single person in our government is in charge of all this. These budgets are all in different departments. And there's no strategy document for the whole thing. So no metrics, no coalition, not enough money, and no overall strategy. That's half the recommendations right there. How am I doing on time, Kevin?
A minute.
One more minute. The other recommendations have to do with how, if we had a strategy, if we had a coalition, if we had a sense of competitiveness, what would we like China to become? We have a right to think that. We can't make it happen, but we could think about it. And one hint is 2 or 3 of my recommendations have to do with understanding better the debate in Beijing. At the minimum, hardliners versus moderates, but every one of these fields I've been mentioning actually has a political policy debate going on. There's professors at Beijing University who publicly said the Constitution of China should be above the Communist Party of China. And for a while, there was a bit of a debate. President Xi Jinping had just taken office, said something positive about this. Later on, he changed his mind, said, no, the party is above the Constitution. What did the American president or the American government do about this debate? It's fairly important. China puts its constitution above the Communist Party. It changes the way the rule of law is enforced. We did nothing. Our government said absolutely nothing. Radio Free Asia covered the story. You could sort of count them. A couple of newspaper articles were written. What happened? The advocates were put in jail or told to stop blogging. So we lost an opportunity. 3 of my recommendations are about the way China specialists, whether it's Mark Stokes or Bill Gertz or Wei Jingsheng or all of us here, the way we think about China. If they're having debates, we need to know about it. And we need to be careful, at the least, that we don't hurt people whose point of view is similar to ours, and then we don't help what I would call the hardliners. Individual Chinese know about this. If you ask somebody, what about Wei Jingsheng and the 5th modernization? You can find people saying, put him in jail and then kill him. You can find others who say, no, no, Wei Jingsheng was a prophet. We should have followed his advice. So those who think about China have to get used to the idea. People debate positions, some go to jail, some get to make policy. It's a new way of thinking about China. It means we could never use the word again, the Chinese or the Communist Party, because many of these debates are inside the Communist Party of China. Many of them take place at the highest level. My last point is just to quote somebody I quote in the book, Kevin. We had a great ambassador to China named Jim Lilly. He was the boss of Major Stokes at the time. He says, you know, if we had known at the time I was ambassador in May, June 1989, if we had known about this debate going on about what to do about the students at Tiananmen, if we had known the hardliners were filtering information that was false to Deng Xiaoping, saying, the students want to kill you, They want to kill the Standing Committee of the Politburo. We must stop them. This was false. No student had said that. A number of other false kinds of information came in. Lilly says he didn't know this at the time. He could not do anything about it. He could have invited, one idea he had is to bring Brent Scowcroft from Washington with a letter from Father Bush saying something about the students aren't trying to kill you. He lamented our lack of knowledge and focus on debates at the highest levels inside Beijing. So I hope you think I did a good job with my 12 recommendations in 12 minutes. I brought extra free copies of the book, and I decided that the best 3 tough questioners get a free book. Thank you.
There's obviously a debate, there has been a debate for years within this country on the best way to change China's behavior. And, you know, a lot of people have doubts about the ability of this country to change the fundamental nature of China as a one-party state, that it's going to need to be done from within. And the issue is, what can we do to provide additional support that doesn't make the situation worse in terms of an eventual transition into a more pluralistic, free and democratic society.
Okay, I think that's a good question. Who wants to do it? You can go first, Mark. Go ahead. That's fine.
I personally don't have the answer, but I would offer one thing to think about a little bit. And it goes back to our U.S. One China policy, which has been in place in one form or another since 1943. Between 1949 and 1979, or let me say it like this, between 1949 until 1972, our One China policy was premised on the idea, it's kind of a zero-sum game in which you can only have formal diplomatic relations with one side of the Taiwan Strait, and then sort of an informal or no formal diplomatic relations with the other side. At that time, it was acknowledging the ROC as a sole legitimate government of China in the international community. Between 1979 and in the wake of the second communique, we switched, de-recognized the Republic of China and recognized the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China in the international community. Bear in mind that between 1972 and 1979, we had relatively normal relations within the context of our One China policy with both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Now, in the past, this may not have been a problem, but if you view our One China policy as being zero-sum in nature, this wasn't an issue up until, let's say, 2000, when you had the first democratic election on Taiwan. It wasn't necessarily maybe even a problem until maybe 2004, when you had a second election, or a second transfer of power, peaceful transfer of power in history in 2008. The problem now is if you view our One China policy as a zero-sum game, we extend legitimacy to an authoritarian, to the Chinese Communist Party, authoritarian government on that side of China, and withhold at least equal legitimacy to a liberal democracy, the Republic of China, in the sense of having formal diplomatic relations with one side and withholding that legitimacy of the other side. I would argue that eventually this by itself doesn't, what kind of signal does this send to others in the world? There shouldn't be a surprise when Freedom House comes out and says that actually the number of countries, states that have been identified as sort of democracies is diminishing because of the type of legitimacy that through our current way of approaching our One China policy extended. This is certainly not to say to support Taiwan independence or to support completely breaking out of the One China policy, but simply because of objective reality, which is the existence of the ROC, and because it sends the wrong signal and not extending legitimacy to a democracy, that what more could be feasibly be done within the context of our One China policy. Generally, this comes into what's called One China, Two Governments, which has always been somewhat of a mainstream in certain parts of the U.S. government. Up until 1979, it was always an option. But I would just use that sort of as an idea in terms of what, not necessarily going in and suddenly and possibly making things worse within China itself, but simply holding up the possibility of what a Chinese, at least a society in which has inherit some aspects of Chinese culture, when you deny them legitimacy as a democracy and what signal that sends to the rest of the people in the world, and particularly within people in China itself.
Okay, is there another question? We have to move to the next panel. Okay. This,
Bill wanted to.
well,
That's okay.
we
Yeah,
can only
take
spend
another
so much
question.
time on each question. So, yeah. Yes, okay, go ahead.
Philip, Mike, thank you very much for telling us that it's only $50 million spending on China's democracy movement. It's so disproportionate to the size of China.
Questioners have to give their names. The first question, I didn't hear his name, and now she's not giving her name. It would be helpful to know who is.
My name is Charlotte.
That's Barry Solars, who's an international trade consultant.
Okay, very.
My name is Charlotte. So I'm just, I'm curious about, you say like there's only $50 million spent on China's human rights and democracy. So why it is so disproportionate to the population size of China and like other African country, like you say medium-sized African country? Why the budget is so disproportionate? And is there anything can do to increase the size of the funding?
Yes. You have three very different people up here on your panel, counting Kevin, four very different people. Bill Gertz is a world-famous journalist and author. Mark Stokes was an Air Force officer with a specialty in signals intelligence. While they were doing that, I was a Senate staffer getting legislation passed. I worked for a long time on the legislation which was completely opposed for Radio Free Asia. President Bush and Assistant Secretary Solomon said they would veto this. It was the worst idea they'd ever heard of, to have a Radio Free Asia. We got a coalition of Biden, Pell, Jesse Helms, Orrin Hatch, quite a few others, did a study commission. Now there's a very big Radio Free Asia. Takes a long time to raise money, increase budgets, get focused. It takes legislation. Both houses have to pass it. The president has to sign it. I did the same thing with another group to create something called the National Endowment for Democracy. Many, many opponents. This is a stupid idea. Senator Ted Stevens got up and on the Senate floor said it's immoral and unethical to fund American political parties to have operations overseas with federal money. Today, the National Endowment for Democracy has a budget of $110 million. Everybody thinks it's as American as apple pie. A third piece of legislation was the United States, first it was called Peace Academy, then we changed the name to Institute of Peace. Have you seen the big building by the State Department? $100 million. Everybody wants to be there, get a fellowship, they publish books. We were given a veto threat by President Reagan. I don't want a U.S. Peace Institute. I'll take some money and put it in the Arms Control Agency to do research on negotiating tactics. That's it. Both houses passed it. President signed it. Everybody wants to be on the board, gives fellowships. It's a huge, big building next to the State Department.
We have to move on to our next panel. So
Chinese
in two
issues
sentences, what
and-
what would it take to coalesce?
It will take legislation. We have, right now, there's the
Who's going to
China
drive, who's
Policy
going to drive
Act.
the legislation?
The China Policy Act of '95 essentially expired. The Hong Kong Policy Act does not require reports anymore. It's essentially expired. The Tibet Policy Act still works a little bit in a very narrow area. There's no Master Overall China Strategy Act. There's no GAO investigations. All the things you learned when you were a Foreign Service officer assigned to the Foreign Relations Committee on China need to be brought into play. We are operating on executive branch thinking about China, which is never going to change. So legislation, learning what has to be done, Large numbers of senators and congressmen passing legislation has to happen. It will take several years. In the meantime, there'll be many opponents who will stand up and say, no, we don't want a China Democracy Act. That was proposed last week, by the way. China Democracy Act doesn't exist. To say no government department should take activities or actions in China that undercut democracy. The law is not even drafted yet, just proposed last week. The metrics doesn't exist. The National Competitiveness Act never drafted as legislation, as far as I know. So we're starting close to ground zero in all this.
Well, there's a challenge for all of us in the room and on the panels.